This work, being presented today by each of the researchers involved, examines the formation of an organic pedagogical space by youth and for youth that speaks to young people's taking of responsibility for their own education. The project, termed Students Organizing for Unity and Liberation, or SOUL, is an educational space of hope, seeking to enact an organic curriculum through action dialogues, which are an iterative process of dialogue, action, and dialogue. This work further examines a theme that's emerged as well as associated topics. It examines the ecosystem of surveillance to which young people are subjected in a Massachusetts city largely populated by communities of color and racialized immigrants. This work explores this ecology in relation to two important topics that have surfaced related to surveillance and the school to prison nexus. These topics include the presence of and use of police or school resource officers as permanent staff in our schools, and the uses and abuses of high stakes testing. This research traces out how surveillance associated with the exercise of state power is mobilized and how the group enacts counter-hegemonic and abolitionist praxis.
This project is a youth-based participatory action research, which is a community-based research framework that is focused on centering youths and identifying harm at the hands of public, social, and institutional policies, and cultivating ways to interrupt systems of oppression that contribute to the marginalization of our identities and realities, and moving towards more equitable and just practices and policies. Rather than an approach that seeks to conduct research on communities and youth, this research seeks to conduct research with communities and youth, giving them the agency and ownership over the ways in which it's conducted. This approach extends beyond sharing research tools, collecting data, and utilizing data to address and disturb oppressive dynamics, but the youth are fully involved as co-authors, conference presenters, and are involved in the dissemination of the intellectual work. All of this is understood as a process not beyond the life of soul, but constitutive of soul. Methodologically, through this youth participatory action research, we have used the techniques of ethnographic observations and the collection of interviews and newspaper articles done on this project, documents such as meeting agendas and minutes, and video and audio recordings of dialogue sessions conducted by the participants.
The New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools is a grassroots, community-based organization primarily made up of New Bedford families, students, and educators. The mission of the NBC SOS is to create caring schools that work to support the physical, social, and emotional development of all students so that they become creative, compassionate participants who are capable and willing to transform society in the direction of equity. SOUL is an organization within NBC SOS, and it emerged in the midst of multiple pandemics: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate catastrophe, and the long-standing state-sanctioned violence brutally reincarnated in the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd. As the writer and activist Arundhati Roy observed in her essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing can be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. SOUL was built out of a powerful realization that we live in a society unprepared to protect its citizens and non-citizens from a public health pandemic, and yet fully prepared to unleash its authoritative arm in the form of state sanctioned violence at the hands of police, militarized terror against those who protest that violence, and in the form of social control through high stakes schooling and standardized testing. Soul did not develop spontaneously. A number of events, demonstrations, and campaigns over the past few years, in many instances led by New Bedford youth, and in every instance involving New Bedford youth, contributed to the formation of Soul. The first being the New Bedford Charter Resistance. In 2018, the NBC SOS, including the local and state teachers union, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, resisted a backdoor deal that was rushed to avoid public scrutiny between the mayor of New Bedford, the commissioner of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and the executive director of a New Bedford charter school. The deal involved allowing for 450 charter seats, the gifting of public property to the charter school at no cost, and the automatic enrollment of students in the school neighborhood into the privately run charter school. This neighborhood charter school model would have been the first of its kind in the state, set a legislative precedent, and been implemented statewide. The NBCSOS defeated the deal through extensive grassroots organizing and a class action lawsuit by 10 families. In 2019, the youth in the NBCSOS led a successful climate walkout at the local high school in order to participate in solidarity walkouts across the world. Youth organizers delivered powerful speeches and maintained a safe, open space for students to share their concerns. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the State Teachers Union, NBCSOS, and other New Bedford youth not affiliated with the coalition, but in solidarity with the coalition, engaged in a campaign to demand that students and educators would return to school buildings only when it was safe. The NBCSOS chalked up the sidewalk around the Central Administration Building with demands for a safe return and organized caravans and other demonstrations. A New Bedford High School student led a powerful arts-based installation at the high school and in the front of the school committee, calling attention to the dangers of a return to in-person schooling, particularly in a city with outdated ventilation systems and all-around inadequate infrastructure.
In 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. National outrage prompted the coalition, along with From the Community for the Community, a group of youth activists, to revisit an injustice in our own community. Organizing began again, demanding the termination and criminal charging of police officers involved in the cover-up and killing of Malcolm Gracia, a 15-year-old boy shot and killed by New Bedford police in May of 2012. The coalition, in partnership with these other organizations, launched multiple rallies, arts-based installations in the city, and 2 caravan protests with hundreds of vehicles. Stops were made at the homes of multiple local and state officials demanding an indictment of the officers, and this actually led to the formation of a council to investigate the police use of force. In 2020, the New Bedford High School Alumni for Black Lives and the NBCSOS petitioned for the removal of school resource officers, which are police officers, from New Bedford public schools. NBCSOS and the Alumni for Black Lives, in collaboration, issued a call to action to New Bedford city officials and released a series of public statements regarding police presence in schools, the criminalization of youth, social control, youth surveillance, and the damage of punitive and zero-tolerance policies. Most recently, NBCSOS organized statewide and virtual community forums for families to learn how to opt their students out of MCAS. Students from New Bedford and beyond participated to share their stories about high-stakes standardized testing with hundreds of families in Massachusetts, and youth also participated in opt-out caravan protests and standouts. Amidst all the talks of schools failing our communities, Soul was built in and through W.E.B. Du Bois' notion that a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. State-sanctioned schooling will never be counter-hegemonic, at least not in an uninterrupted way. Youth were clear that they wanted to continue struggling for counter-hegemonic spaces in public schools, however temporary that they may be. And they also made clear the desire for developing spaces where they are less inhibited by institutional rituals and control, scientific management, and audit cultures that arrest the mind by regimenting teaching and learning within the parameters of capitalist neoliberal education. The youth involved in the charter resistance, climate strike, Only When It's Safe campaign, Justice for Malcolm, Police Free Schools campaign, and MCAS opt-out campaign are now leading Seoul. Seoul functions through what the group calls action dialogues. These dialogues are structured through an organic curriculum designed by young people and involve an iterative process of dialogue, action, dialogue, seeking to connect knowledges and invest emotions into concrete projects that counter structural and institutional justice. We are indebted to the work of Paulo Freire, Ella Baker's organizing model, and the Combahee River Collective Statement on Intersectionality. Freire's three concepts are especially important. One, praxis, that is his point that it is not enough for people to come together in dialogue in order to gain knowledge of their social reality. They must act together upon their environment in order to critically reflect upon their reality and so transform it through further action and critical reflection. Two, generative themes, which is, in the words of Freire, characterized by a complex of ideas, concepts, hopes, and doubts, values and challenges in dialectical interaction with their opposites striving towards fulfillment. And three, dialogue, as Freire states, to enter into dialogue presupposes equality amongst participants. Each must trust the others. There must be mutual respect and love, care and commitment. Each one must question what he or she knows and realize that through dialogue, existing thoughts will change and new knowledge will be created.
My name is Noah. I'm one of the circle leaders for Seoul, and I will be presenting the first part of the findings. And I would like to first posit that the very existence of Seoul is resistance. The community-based educational space that we cultivate exists beyond the epistemic boundaries structured by the state. Seoul serves as a site where youth develop and deepen their language to effectively name structural and institutional forms of oppression as well as resistance. Furthermore, Seoul does not reify conventional norms of education. Additionally, we do not just question those norms, we embody the possibility of something different. As a recent article in a local newspaper described the organizational structure of Seoul, they said, and quoting here, "There is no set curriculum. The participants are active in guiding their own learning." End quote. The leadership that we have designed is horizontal rather than hierarchical, illustrating the social and political agency of the students rather than simply viewing them as individuals that need to be shaped and molded. This highlights the power that lies within the students and questions the legitimacy of the institution of education and its monopoly on learning. The setting of student empowerment that exists outside of the epistemic boundaries of the state allows for the existence of Seoul to be an abolitionist project. Every other Friday, Seoul engages in an abolitionist praxis. The abolitionist framework that Seoul operates through leads us to one of our core findings. Young people are maladjusted to school, but they're not maladjusted to learning. This is a critical distinction that often gets lost. What excites participants is dialogue on what is socially considered to be taboo: structural racism, heteronormativity, capitalism, and etc. The need for these discussions was captured in various utterances, and one participant, one of our students, stated that, and this is a quote, "Getting into this program really helped to inform me more." And that was end quote from Chloe. Chloe is a sophomore who attends New Bedford Oak, and she went on to say, "Hearing everyone speak about their personal experiences and stuff has just been really informative." End quote. Our capacity to have discussions about topics that the state allows to remain unquestioned allows for the students to discover that they enjoy the act of learning, but do not enjoy the indoctrination that comes with the hegemonic institutions that their learning typically comes through. We found that our students are not only willing to try something new, but also desire new modes of learning where the state does not have a monopoly on their education. In addition to our discovery that the students enjoy learning but not in the institution that they are often forced to learn through, we found that the unique structure of circle leadership led to a shift from the I to the we, a transition from the individual to the collective. Upon reflecting on soul and its structure, Celeste, a junior at New Bedford High School, stated that we don't feel like there's a power difference between all of us. It's pretty leveled, and we all feel comfortable voicing our opinions without fear of getting judged. End quote. Celeste's comments illustrate not only a lack of an apparent power dynamic between the students and circle leaders, but it also demonstrates Celeste's sense of belonging to the larger collective of soul. We have found that this sense of community lays the foundation for the generative and oftentimes personal discussions that we have during Soul. Our observations of the students and their reflections incentivize us to believe that an educational environment where the students are just as important as the instructors naturally facilitates the transition from the I to the we while maintaining the agency of the individual, allowing for students to bring all of themselves into the space instead of the typical model where students are expected to leave their personal identities at the door when they enter the school building. Thank you. And so those are the first findings. I will be now handing this off to my fellow circle leader, Jahari.
There's a lot to be said about what can sort of come out of the conversations we have as a group in Soul. Uh, and I'll say this every time I talk about Soul, but I feel it's really amazing to be a part of that space where young people are able to reflect critically on their realities and sort of, pick apart the intersectionality within those realities. Um, Given, the nature of our discussions and, this abolitionist framework, the students have shown, an amazing ability to delve into these critical avenues of conversation and thought. Naturally, one of the first things we sort of picked apart was, the ways that schools, public schools as an institution, are failing us. And one thing that the students were really able to resonate with is sort of recognizing all the ways that their marginalized identities were not being served by the schools they're a part of, right? We look at school practices like high stakes standardized testing, and we see them as a means of sort of social control, of regimenting, the way that young people think, of sort of trying to colonize that space for imagination and really ultimately, putting boundaries on what type of discourse and conversation these young people can have. Um, Maintaining this sort of heteronormative patriarchal white model, really establishing institutional whiteness as the normal, um, and not giving any space to have real conversations about things like structural racism in schools, about heteronormativity, about patriarchy in schools. So it's amazing to see how adept they are in having these conversations, given the lack thereof of those spaces in schools, right? And I think that brings us to a point where we're able to see that students are not maladjusted to any form of learning, because if that were the case, there was no way we could be having these critical conversations. The issue is that schools are maladjusting to the learning needs of the student, right? And I think that really brings us to a point where we need to reconsider what we think about as learning and what we think about as schools, because this idea that things shouldn't be talked about because they're controversial or uncomfortable is ultimately just about maintaining this sort of whiteness protection program, right? And the thing with that is that as these students or participants rather have come to realize is that, in doing that and maintaining this whiteness, you necessitate the conditions for violence against, Black and brown kids, namely, as well as kids from other marginalized identities. So I think as a group, we've come a long way in developing those lines of thought in an abolitionist framework, as well as, sort of grounding our own identities in um, a broader social movement. So it's been great.
To speak to the significance of this work, community-based spaces created by youth and young adults for youth can be, as Bianca Baldridge has pointed out, critical locations for social, political, and cultural development of young people, particularly Black, Latinx, and other youth experiencing oppression. It's about acknowledging the humanity of young people in ways that schools often disregard with the conditioning of students through curriculum, standardized testing, SROs, and other confining structures. Youth led spaces allow the participants to imagine and reshape the environments they live in. Youth workers educate and nurture young people all the time, but are rarely regarded as teachers in the conventional sense. And we need to take this seriously. But we must also make certain that this type of work does not become regimented in ways that teacher work is organized and controlled through audit structures. In short, it must be subject to neoliberal forms of reasoning. It must remain organic and build upon the interests of the students. The focus should be on engagement and less on the traditional ways that we understand teaching and learning. Youth workers must be understood as experts who are able to understand and creatively respond to the multiple needs of young people. It's important to not view this work as the solution for curing all social ills, but it is one space for healing and transformative change that will begin to foster a new network of young individuals that will be able to effectively communicate and work towards change. In the end, we must keep our focus on deep structural oppression and work to dismantle it by whatever means necessary.